So they have just released the Synodal Synthesis document, a Synodal Church and Mission. And I just thought I'd take you through this document quickly. It's a 41-page document, and if we go to the table of contents, I just take you through some of what was in the various chapters. And so it was divided into three parts: the face of the Synodal Church, all disciples, all missionaries, weaving bonds, building communities. And so in the first part, they discussed synodality, experience and understanding, gathered and sent by the Trinity, entering the community of faith, Christian initiation, people in poverty, protagonists of the church's journey, a church out of every tribe, tongue, people and nation, the Eastern churches and Latin church traditions, but didn't discuss the traditional Latin Mass, but anyway, on the road towards Christian unity. In the second part, all disciples, all missionaries, churches, mission, women in the life and mission of the church, a consecrated life and lay associations and movements, a charismatic sign, deacons and priests in a synodal church, the bishop in ecclesial communion, the Bishop of Rome and the College of Bishops. Weaving bonds, building communities, a synodal approach to formation, ecclesial discernment and open questions towards a listening and accompanying church, mission in the digital environment, structures of participation, groupings of churches within the communion of the whole church, and the Synod of Bishops and ecclesial assemblies. So a lot of the hot topic issues I've just ran through it are not mentioned in this document, I can tell you. So there, it seems like, as in the tablet, it says the progressives got the process, but the conservatives got the content. And now how conservative this content is, I don't know. I think you'd need a couple of days to study this in depth. But anyway, we have the introduction that to this document, pages 2 and 3. You can read it. I'm going to post a link below so you can go through it yourself. And the face of the Synodal Church. So what they did, from what I can see, is they had convergences, matters for consideration, proposals. So this is the three-pronged approach that they had: convergences. We welcome the invitation to recognize the synodal dimension of the church with a new awareness. But anyway, it was all, I suppose, you could really say that this whole document is to kind of embed the word synodality, and a discussion forum as such. Now, whether that's a good or a bad thing, I mean, I suppose in years to come we'll have to see. So they're just here talking about synodality, that concept, the convergences, matters from consideration, building a reflective work already undertaking. There is a need to clarify the meaning of synodality at different levels in pastoral, theological, canonical terms. This helps to avert the risk of the concept seems too vague or generic, or appears as a fad or fashion. It enables us to offer a broad understanding of walking together with further theological deepening and clarification. Likewise, it is necessary to clarify the relationship between synodality and communion, and between synodality and collegiality. So these are the matters of consideration, and then you have some proposals. So this is the format you have practically on each chapter: convergences, matters from consideration, and proposals. So I do take your time to go through each of these chapters. Entering the communion of faith, Christian initiation, and so it's interesting to read what is being discussed here. I mean, and I've nothing really against what is being said in the document, in the sense that I'm not a theologian, and I'm not an expert in canon law, so I'm just a layman giving my assessment here and reading through the document that was put together. As I said in a previous video, there is nothing in here for laymen, for fathers, married fathers, in the sense that it's not addressing specific problems that the church is facing. Why are young men not engaging in the faith? Why are young families, especially here in Ireland, not engaging in the faith? Why is the youth? And there could be a whole chapter there on youth and catechesis. But sadly, I don't think, did they actually mention catechesis? They actually mentioned just twice, so yeah, very sad that they haven't mentioned more of this. But anyway, just going through this document, this is how the chapter, the whole document is structured: convergences, matters for consideration, and proposals. If the Eucharist shapes synodality, then the first step we should take is to celebrate the Mass in the ways that it befits the gift, with an authentic sense of friendship in Christ. Liturgy celebrated with authenticity is the first and fundamental school of discipleship. Its beauty and simplicity should form us prior to any other organized formation program. How do you put that into practice? Because we've had 50 years of liturgical experiment. People in poverty, protagonists of the church's journey. The church out of every tribe, tongue, people and nation. Convergences, matters for consideration, proposals. The Eastern churches, and Latin church traditions. I find it very interesting how the church accepts, allows, fosters what Eastern churches do with reverend liturgies, with their theological, ecclesiastical, canonical distinctions. And yet, I don't see anything here towards the traditional movement in the Latin Rite Church. But it's a sad reality that it's not even discussed here. But anyway, on the road towards Christian unity, that's actually a good topic to discuss, and it comes from the gospel that they may be one. So I do find it interesting that, what they discuss here in the matters for consideration. Our assembly was able to perceive the diverse ways different Christian traditions understand the synodal configuration of the church. In Christian churches, synodality is understood as a strict sense, as an expression of the collegial exercise of the authority proper to the bishops alone, the Holy Synod. Broadly, it refers to the active participation of all faithful in the life and mission of the church. There were some references to practices in other ecclesial communities enriching our debates. All this requires further investigation. Of course, we've had a synod here where Rome has brought laity into the church, and this is a very novel view of synodality that does not exist in the Orthodox Church. So if you're moving towards unity and you want to propose and you want to offer unity, are you going to diverge so much that, Eastern churches would never accept the process that we're trying to introduce? Another theme to be explored concerns the link between synodality and primacy at the various levels, local, regional, universal, in their mutual interdependence. We need a shared rereading of history in order to overcome stereotypes and prejudices. Ongoing ecumenical dialogues have provided a better understanding, in light of the practices of the first millennium, of the fact that synodality and primacy are related, complementary and inseparable realities. The clarification of this delicate point has consequences for the way of understanding the Petrine ministry in the service of unity, according to what John Paul II wished in the encyclical Ut Unum Sint. Totally agree with that point. We need to examine the issue of Eucharistic hospitality from theological, canonical, and pastoral perspectives in the light of the link between sacramental and ecclesial communion. This issue is of particular importance for interchurch couples. It raises the need for a broader reflection on interchurch marriages. Reflection was also needed on the phenomenon of non-denominational communities and Christian-inspired revival movements, which are also joined in large numbers by faithful who were originally Catholic. Interesting. So, some proposals. The year of 2025 marks the anniversary of the Council of Nicaea in 2025, at which the symbol of the faith that unites all Christians was elaborated. A common commemoration of this event will help us to better understand how, in the past, controversial questions were discussed and resolved together at the Council. In the same year, providentially, the date for the celebration of Easter will coincide for all churches of Christian communities. The Assembly expressed a keen desire to come to a common date for the Feast of Easter so that we can celebrate the resurrection of the Lord, our life and our salvation on the same day. Interesting. Yeah, I quite like some of these proposals. It's not all negative at all. And, I when I read Ut Unum Sint when it was published back in the day, I thought, it was an interesting document. And so, yeah, interesting. Yeah, nothing bad. Church and mission, convergences, matters for consideration and proposals. I'm going to leave you to read that yourself. And in its time. Then we have women in the life of the church and mission of the church. Now, as I said before, I have nothing wrong with this being discussed. But if you're going to discuss women in the life of the church, you also have to discuss men in the life of the church. And I'm not talking about clerics. I'm talking about ordinary men. Married men, single men that are not interested in the clerical life, that are not interested in becoming deacons, that are not interested in becoming priests or married priests or bishops. What is their role in the church? What is their role, women, in the life and mission of the church? What is the role of men, married men, laymen, ordinary men in the life of the church? I'm just going to read through some of the proposals. Local churches are encouraged to extend their work of listening, accompaniment and care to most marginalised women in their social context. Well, you could actually say the same about men. What are we doing to do that for men? It is urgent to ensure that women can participate in the decision-making process to assume roles of responsibility in pastoral care and ministry. You could say the same about men. Not as I said, not many. There are 99% of men are not called to be clerics of religious life. The Holy Father has significantly increased the number of women in positions and responsibility in the Roman Curia. It should also happen at other levels of the church, in consecrated life and diocese. Provision needs to be made in canon law accordingly. Again, I ask, what about men? Theological and pastoral research on the access of women to the diaconate should be continued, benefiting from consideration of the results of the commissions especially established by the Holy Father, and from the theological, historical and the exegetical research already undertaken. If possible, the results of this research should be presented in the next session of the Assembly. So they haven't got women deacons yet, but they're definitely pushing it for it next year. Will be interesting. I mean, the Pope himself has come out in an interview against this proposal, and he's already changed canon law to bar even a woman being ordained a deacon. So it'll be interesting what exactly they will try in the next synod. So all eyes will be on next year. Cases of labour injustice and unfair remuneration within the church need to be addressed, especially for women in consecrated life who are too often treated as cheap labour. I agree with that. Women's access to formation programs and theological study needs to be considerably expanded. I agree with that. We suggest that women should also be integrated into seminary teaching and training programs to foster better formation for ordained ministry. I agree with that. There is a need to ensure the liturgical texts and the church documents are more attentive to the use of language and takes into equal consideration both men and women, and also includes a range of words, images, and narratives that draw more widely on women's experience. We propose that women receive appropriate formation to enable them to be judges in all canonical processes. Okay, so consecrated life and lay associations and movements, a charismatic sign. And I leave you to read that. Deacons and priests in a synodal church. Interesting. Deacons and priests in a synodal church. What are the matters for consideration? I suppose we talk about clericalism. Clericalism stems from an understanding of the divine call, viewing it more as a privilege than a service, and manifesting itself in the exercise of power in a worldly manner that refuses to allow itself to be accountable. I mean, when you were writing this, we had famous ex-Jesuit Mark Rupnik, who gets rehabilitated and incarnated in the diocese in Slovenia, and is allowed to act still use his ministry. And I suppose, that if we want to end clericalism, maybe an investigation into that should have happened. Anyway, matters for I'm going to leave you to read. I'm going to put the link below and lead you to read this document in more consideration. Proposals. I'm just going to read proposals. In the Latin Church, the permanent diaconate has been implemented in different ways in different ecclesial contexts. Some local churches have not introduced it at all, and others there is concern that deacons are perceived as a kind of substitute for the shortage of priests. Sometimes their ministry finds expression in the liturgy rather than in service to those living in poverty and who are in need in the community. We therefore recommend an assessment on how the diaconal ministry has been implemented since Vatican II. From the theological point of view, there is a need to understand the diaconate first and foremost in itself, and not only as a stage of access to the presbyterate. Qualifying the primary form of the diaconate as permanent to distinguish it from transitional form is itself an indication of a change of perspective that has not yet been adequately realized. The uncertainty surrounding the theology of the diaconate in relation to the fact that it has only been restored to its distinct and permanent hierarchical ministry in the Latin Church since the Second Vatican Council. Deep study will shed light on the question of access to women to the diaconate. So they are definitely leaving that door open, and that will be interesting in the next synod. A thorough review of formation for ordained ministry in view of the missionary and synodal dimensions of the Church is called for. This means also reviewing the ratio fundamentalis that determines how formation is structured. We also recommend at the same time ensuring the adoption of a synodal style, which when it comes to the ongoing formation of priests and deacons. So interesting. Synodal, it's really they're implementing the process is being implemented here. Anyway, the bishop in ecclesial communion is the next one, and it goes on to talk about that, and I lead you to read that. The Bishop of Rome in the College of Bishops. What were the matters? There is a need for more insight into how renewed understanding of the episcopate within the Synodal Church affects the ministry of the Bishop of Rome and the role of the Roman Curia. This issue has significant implications for the way co-responsibility in the church governance is lived out. At a universal level, the Code of Canon Law and Code of Canons of Eastern Churches offer provisions for a more collegial exercise of the papal ministry. These could be further developed in practice and strengthened in a church update of both texts. Anyway, it is proposed to enhance and strengthen the experience of the College of Cardinals as a synodal council at the service of the Petrine ministry. Well, you need to start talking to some of these cardinals. I remember poor Cardinal Zen when he went to Rome. I remember that time the Pope didn't want to receive him. It seems the approach to establish forms of evaluation of work at the pontifical representatives by the local churches in the countries where they carry out their mission to facilitate and perfect their service. Okay. In the light of the teaching of Vatican II, it is necessary to carefully evaluate whether it is opportune to ordain the prelates of the Roman Curia as bishops. That's interesting. That's interesting because you have a lot of people working in the Vatican. You know, if you're a nuncio, they will ordain you as a prelate, and I find that very interesting now that the Pope is moving away, especially after Vigano. I find it very interesting that the Pope is moving away from ordaining bishops. I mean, we've seen it with the Opus Dei, that the head of the Opus Dei now is no longer a bishop. Not that there was many of them in it, but there was now the head of the Opus Dei is not a bishop, and I see it here now that it's mentioned. If it was opportune to ordain the prelates of the Roman Curia as bishops. Very interesting. I mean, we have Vigano that's going around ordaining people left, right and centre from what we hear secretly. So I see why Rome is getting anxious about who they ordain as bishops going forward. Weaving bonds and building communities. A synodal approach to formation. I'll let you read through that. Ecclesial discernment and open questions. Let me see here. Proposed matters for consideration. We identified the need for reflection on the conditions to enable theological and cultural research that takes as its starting point the daily experience of God's holy people and places itself at its service. Interesting. Towards a listening and an accompanying church. Matters for listening requires unconditional acceptance. It does not mean compromising proclamation of the gospel or endorsing any opinion or position proposed. Jesus opened up new horizons and pathways for people to whom he listened unconditionally. And in order to share the good news of salvation with those we encounter, we are called to do likewise. Widespread in many parts of the world, small Christian communities foster listening practices of and amongst the baptized. We are called to enhance their potential, in particular by exploring how they can be adopted in urban contexts. Interesting. The mission in a digital environment. Matters for consideration. This will be interesting. The internet is increasingly present in the lives of children and families. While it has great potential to improve people's lives, it can also cause harm and injury, such as through intimidation, disinformation, sexual exploitation, and addiction. There is an urgent need to consider how Christian community can support families in ensuring that online space is not only safe but also spiritually life-giving. There are many valuable and useful church-related online initiatives that provide excellent catechesis and faith formation. Unfortunately, there are also sites where faith-related issues are addressed in a superficial, polarized, and even hate-filled manner. As a church and as individual digital missionaries, we have a duty to ask ourselves how we can ensure that our online presence constitutes an experience of growth for those with whom we communicate. I agree with that. Online apostolic initiatives have a reach and scope that extends beyond traditionally understood territorial boundaries. They raise important questions about how we can regulate and which ecclesiastical authorities should be responsible for supervision. We must also consider the implications of the new digital missionary frontier for the renewal of existing parish and diocesan structures. In an increasing digital world, how do we avoid being trapped within a mindset that seeks only to conserve what we are already doing, and instead of unleash new energies for a new forms of mission? The COVID-19 pandemic stimulated a range of creative online pastoral initiatives that reduced the effects of the experience of isolation and loneliness experienced particularly by elderly and vulnerable community members. Catholic educational institutions also used online platforms to effectively continue offering the formation catechesis during lockdowns. We need to assess what this experience has taught us and what the lasting benefits might be for the Church's mission in the digital environment. It was interesting during COVID how many people started watching traditional Latin Mass online and then actually went to a Latin Mass afterwards. I thought that was fascinating. I mean, what COVID did was an interesting experience. While young people do seek beauty, many young people are abandoned by physical spaces of the Church into which we continue to try and invite them, favouring instead online spaces. This has implications for how we try to engage them and seek to offer them formation and catechesis. This is something to consider for pastoral perspective. Anyway, structures for participation, groupings of churches within the communion of the whole Church. What does it say here? Before creating new ecclesial structures, we need to strengthen and revitalize those who exist. There's a need for ecclesiastical and canonical study of the implications of the reform related to the groupings of churches so that they may assume a more fully synodal character. Considering the synodal practices of the churches of the first millennium, we suggest a study exploring how ancient institutions can be recovered in the current canonical order and harmonizing them with new created ones such as episcopal conferences. Interesting. The Synod of Bishops and Ecclesial Assemblies, and proceeding along in the journey. Anyway, I'm going to put a link down here to the document. You can read through it yourselves. It's not very long. It is 40 pages. It's not... it's a far cry from what the Irish synthesis document was. It really is a far cry from it. But sadly, it doesn't address the day-to-day real issues of Catholics, and how you evangelize in the real world today. What are people spending their actual time on? How can we evangelize in a real world? And as women had their whole chapter, I was very sad that there wasn't something directed to men. I'm not talking about clerics. I'm talking about ordinary married or single men that are not involved in the church, in the sense that they're not clerics, they're not deacons or permanent deacons or anything like that. What's their mission? How are you going to evangelize them? And ordinary men's ministry, fatherhood, motherhood even. Anyway, that's my quick review of the document, and I suppose I could go on more, but anyway, I just thought I'd share that now. God bless you. Take care. Bye bye.